My name is Stewart Ross, and I was a 10-year head of a Center of Teaching and Learning at Minnesota State University in Mankato, Minnesota. Towards the end of my career, that's a university of about 15,000 students, has graduate programs, even some doctorate programs. I've been asked to tell my famous story. I've done maybe 180 workshops around the world about course design. And one particular story seems to really be useful to other faculty. And I'm telling the story today more as a faculty member rather than, I might put a few comments in as a person thinking about teaching and learning. But when I was 27, I had my master's degree at Northwestern in music. I had taught 1 year of high school band and then 2 years at a community college as the entire music program. And at that point, I went back to Northwestern University and got my 1 year finished towards the PhD in music education. So it's true that I had a lot of background in music and music education. When I came to the point of getting my 1 year in, I realized I needed to get another job. And I was selected as a professor at Minnesota State University, Mankato. This was, you need to know the date because it'll be important in the story. I arrived in 1977 at a fairly young age for that kind of a job, assistant band director, and all sorts of other music courses. And so they threw me into a course called, back then, Music Appreciation, which was a very scary thing to look at. Putting the word appreciation into a title seemed like a very bad idea to me. And worse yet, the course was taught in the recital hall that held about 350 people and had no desk. It was a recital hall, very dark, even when you turn the lights on, except for the stage. They did have a fairly good sound system for that period of time, some good speakers and so on. So they said I needed to teach the Intro to Music course, which they again called Music Appreciation. Of course, I wasn't about to complain. I was happy to have a job like that at an early age. However, as I went down the hallway and people asked what I was going to be doing, when I said I was teaching the Music Appreciation course, most of them kind of giggled and put a hand over their mouth, or they hid behind a bush or whatever they could do to not talk to me anymore. I did find out years later that this was sort of the punishment course, as you will, or anybody who's new was forced to teach this course. It was frowned upon by most faculty as something that you don't want to do and was very difficult and not much fun. Normally, there were anywhere from 100 to 200 students in the course. There were two different courses. One was during the day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for 50 minutes each, and the other one was a night class for 2.5 hours. I think they liked the night class just because they could get it over in 1 week, but you can imagine the problems of doing that. In any event, I didn't have much time to get ready because I took the place of somebody that had become very ill, and I arrived on campus 1 week into the semester. And I did, while I was there for the interview, I was hired, and I was able to visit the class that somebody was teaching that first week. It looked pretty daunting to me, even with all the background I had. And I mean, I was excited at first to be able to help 200 people learn about music, but subsequently I found out how difficult that might be. Anyhow, on the way home back to Chicago, I had a flight and I was thinking of what to do. And I remembered that background knowledge probes were really important with a course like this. So I sent materials to the teacher that was filling in for that first week. And they did ask the students to answer a few questions that I asked. And the main question that I had on this form for them was, do you like classical music? And this was important because I was supposed to be teaching classical music like 95% of the time, I was told. And by the way, everybody told me, don't worry about it, just write lectures, do lectures, and then give big exams, 100-point multiple choice a couple times during the semester. And that way you won't have to deal with the students much. And if they fail or do badly, you can say that they didn't study and so on. I mean, people actually told me these crazy things. In any event, when I did pack my things and drove to Mankato and then started the course in the second week, it was a daunting thing to go into that course because I read all the 150 forms and they all said they hated classical music. Wow, that's what we call now I realize that that's called a pedagogical challenge, and probably one of the most important pedagogical challenges anybody can deal with, when students do not like what it is that you're teaching, but they are sort of required to be in your course. And of course, we know that this happens to many faculty, as I found out in my many workshops at many universities. Unfortunately, I didn't pay much attention to this. I didn't have much time. I wrote lectures the night before. I thought of recordings I could play, and that's what I did for this first semester. And the students were scared to death because apparently the person that was teaching the course was a very easy grader. He was known as a free A kind of thing, so it was a pretty big class. And I said to the class that, you know, you would get a grade that you deserved on the tests. That was pretty spooky to them, apparently. In any event, I gave these incredible lectures, and I was writing lectures and preparing the night before, trying to stay ahead of the class. And of course, I had a large record collection, and I used recordings I found at the university. And I gave a big exam at midpoint, and people did very poorly. There were a lot of students in the course from other countries. The university had lots of people from other countries. And that was very difficult because they didn't understand Western music, of course, but then I didn't have time to even think about that problem. There were also plenty of football players and sports guys and people that heard it was a free A, and needless to say, that was not easy to deal with either. And many people that thought they didn't have to be there very often. Now, this first course was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so that was fairly good. I got to see them often. And then by the end of the course, they took the second exam, which of course was going to be a total failure also because of the way I was teaching, really. In any event, I still remember one of the most important moments in my teaching career, and that is I had a box and I was sitting on the stage and students would come up and put their exam in, and that would be the end of the course for them. And one young man came up in the middle of people turning them in, and he put it in and he smiled and he looked at me and he said, "Thank you." I said, "Well, that's nice." He said, "Thank you. Now I know why I hate classical music." And he did a 180 and walked out. Well, to say the least, that night, as I thought about this, I realized, yeah, I think in some ways I did teach in a way that probably made them hate classical music. I did nothing to make them think about what this was all about. I just went through the motions of having them listen to music that they didn't understand and didn't really want to listen to. At least they thought they didn't want to. And I thought and thought for the whole summer, because now it was summer. They did hire me for the next year. And of course, they didn't care about the bad grades, the faculty, because everybody had taught the course that way and gotten bad grades. But they said it was a student's fault. So it was an easy way out. But it disturbed me greatly. With all the pedagogy I had done such a miserable job. Upon reflection, thank God that student had the courage to tell me what he really thought. What I thought was going to be a compliment turned out to be a life-changing moment. In any event, during the summer, a movie came out called Star Wars. And I don't need to say much probably to the audience listening. Almost everybody knows about the whole series of Star Wars movies, but this was the very first movie. And I went to the cinema and I was sitting there. And as the music came on with the big speakers, and you'll remember the kind of plexiglass thing that comes on with all the words talking about what Star Wars is all about. Dum, da da dum, da 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 da, and all that exciting music. I looked around and all these college students, high school students, even some adults were cheering and they were so excited. And it seemed like the music was part of that excitement, actually, as I listened to this. Of course, back then, it was exciting to hear the music coming out of those speakers. Most people didn't have that kind of music at home. So I didn't pay that much attention to the beginning of the movie, but I kept thinking about this music. And the more I listened to the music, I didn't know much about Williams, John Williams, who had written that. But the music sounded like a lot of music I knew well from my classical background at Northwestern University and otherwise. I heard music from the Planets by Gustav Holst. I heard Mahler. I heard different composers that were writing music that no doubt John Williams listened to and was using as a basis for his music. And I kept thinking about this after the movie was over. And ultimately, I went to a store. Back then, you could buy a movie with, I don't have it anymore, but I used to bring it to workshops, that giant box that had the tape that went around. You would put it into the machine and it would play the movie for you on your TV set. Of course, most people didn't have a very good speaker, but that was the best you could do. So I went out and bought that with my own money. It wasn't that expensive. And I started thinking about, what if I started the course by getting at the heart of the problem? Because I know that they say they don't like classical music. What if I could prove to them that they actually do like classical music, but it's the way they're framing the discussion? And I also started recreating the course based on getting them more involved and me not just talking to them all the time. So I'll never forget the first day as long as I live. It was a night class, actually, which was, I think, much harder. It was a Monday night, 7 to 9:30 or 7 to 8:30, 2.5 hours. And of course, getting them to concentrate that long is impossible, especially if you're going to lecture about music that they think they hate. Not to mention Monday Night Football was big in Minnesota, and especially when the Vikings were playing the Packers and things like that, you'd have no males after the break as they went home to watch the football game. So that first day I came in with the cassette tape. And of course, this had been almost many months since the movie had come out and all the students had seen it by then. But I went to the machine and I put it in and I turned it on and boom, the movie came on, down, da 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 da, and the words, of course, on the plexiglass about Star Wars. It was fun watching their faces because they had heard what an awful teacher I was and how boring the course is and how I just yak, yak, yak. And it was an impossible. And of course, the course did go down in numbers a little bit after that first one that I taught, but there probably was 100 people there, 100 students. So I played this for some time until that plexiglass finally ended, and then the movie actually starts where people are talking and so on. I wasn't interested in that. So I turned it off. And then I pulled up a chair in the middle of the big stage, and I looked at the students, talk about taking a risk. And I said, so you just heard the music from Star Wars. This movie just came out. It's incredibly popular. And I was at the movie recently and was very excited by the music of this movie. And I said, what do you think? What kind of music would you label this? Is it rock? Is it jazz? Is it popular? Is it classical? And I just threw out a bunch of terms. I said, you know, we have a lot of terms for music. And of course, nobody said anything, which is pretty typical in a course like that, where you're on the stage and there's a giant room. Well, finally, a woman way in back, I couldn't even see her, shouted out, Dr. Ross, I believe that is classical music. Thank you, thank you. I'm thinking in my head, because that's what I needed. I said, well, classical music, what do you think? And then I looked at some faces I could see, and they seemed they could agree to that. I said, well, what makes it classical? And I just said, you know, it's an orchestra, and you hear all the different instruments, and there's no singing necessarily. It's just all the instruments coming together. And it's quite loud in many places. And we know that orchestras can be loud. And then I said the next thing that I needed to say, and that was, so I looked at your comments that all of you did for me before this class, the background probe, and 95% of you said you hate classical music. It's going to be a tough term if you hate classical music, because our job is to listen to classical music and to try and find out what it is about classical music that can be interesting, that can be useful, and that is used throughout the world to enjoy, or even as background, as this, for instance, in this movie. I said, I believe this is classical music, just like the woman in the back of the hall who just said that. I said, raise your hand if you think this could be classical music. And everybody in the room raised their hand, which was a big a gain for me, because I had students actually listening and making some decisions themselves, which we know is important, rather than me just giving lectures. And at that point, I was ready to go. I said, all right, let me play a recording for you. And I pulled out Mars from the Planets. Kind of the background for some of the movies, other movies and things that you would see back then on TV. Flash Gordon was popular back then. And I put it on and I played a little bit of it. And then I stopped and I said, do you think that's classical music? And they all said, yeah. I said, does it sound a lot like Star Wars? Yeah. Everybody agreed it sounded like Star Wars. And it was classical music. And then I pulled out a little bit of a Mahler symphony that I knew would work well. And sure enough, we got the same response that, yeah, that's classical music. In any event, after about 20 minutes of this, I said, so what do you think about all this? You all said you hated classical music, and now you're telling me you like this and you like this, and that's all classical music. And a couple of people raised their hands and said, well, we thought classical music was for cartoons. Bugs Bunny with his fingers on the keyboard, his toes and so on, which was Hungarian Rhapsody and so on. I said, oh, you thought it was all about cartoons. Well, it really isn't. We have symphony orchestras all over the world that are quite successful, and they're playing this type of music. And many of them started saying, yeah, well, I think I wouldn't mind listening to some of this music. And then I hit them with the big one. And I said, well, what we're going to do is understand classical music, at least so you can understand how other people could like it, even if you don't. We're also going to look at a lot of other kind of music. How many of you like Stevie Wonder? He was very popular back. And a lot of hands went up. How about Blood, Sweat, and Tears? Oh, man, everybody's hand went up. The Beatles, everybody got excited. And I said, well, we're going to listen to all kinds of music, but we're going to analyze it, and we're going to understand why it is that we like some things and we don't like things, and why some people only listen to some things, but not other things, and how it might be more useful to listen to more because you would get more excitement in your life, perhaps. Well, by the time at the end of the day, I did have something. I did play a little bit of Stevie Wonder's You Are the Sunshine of My Life. You are the sunshine of my life. It's very syncopated, and it sounded great on the big speakers. And I diagrammed on a whiteboard that we had in the room what was going on. I said, where's the downbeat? It starts da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And if you figure out where the downbeat is, you can start figuring out how this piece works and what he was thinking. You could even get into syncopation and how he changed the rhythm. And we did some of that. And they seemed to really be getting into it. And people were not reading the school newspaper. I didn't see anybody sleeping. They actually seemed to be paying attention. And by the time we finished, I felt this is really working. We're really onto something here, I suspect. And that got me excited about the next presentation, which I didn't call lectures anymore. I started having them do performances, even with a large class. And I started writing performances, especially when we were studying the theory of music, rhythm, tone, color, and all that sort of thing. And I would have them clap and stamp and things, and we would divide it into 3 parts of the room. And it was quite exciting. You could see the smiles on their face. And in spite of themselves, they were getting involved in what was going on. And then I was able to use those ideas when we talked about the different musics that we were listening to. I did get into trouble with some of the faculty, which of course is always going to happen when you try to be imaginative and innovative. Some faculty, after a few weeks, came up and said, we heard weird music coming out of the recital hall during your course. Why are you playing the Beatles? Why are you playing Blood, Sweat, and Tears? Why are you? I said, well, we're going to do all sorts of music because it's called music appreciation. By the way, I did change the name to Intro to Music the next year because that word appreciation really sticks in some of the students' throats. And I think the faculty didn't mind that too much. However, things really went bad with the faculty when a student came up to me after a few weeks and said, you know, could we bring some of our own music before class starts and we could play a little bit of our music? I said, sure. Well, of course, their music was back then, the Beatles and Blood, Sweat and Tears and Elvis Presley and some of those things. So we would have sign up and somebody would be in charge of bringing their music and I would play it and we'd start class. We'd do that about 15 minutes before class. Well, in time, most of the class was there 15 minutes early. Faculty didn't like that. What are you doing in there? You must be giving them drugs or free lunches or pizza. I said, no, we're just playing their music and they get to talk about their music. That was a requirement when somebody was selected. They had to tell us why they liked that music. And we were trying to get at that. And then we came up with a really neat idea. I guess I came up with, I handed out note cards when they came in and they had to write, to get in the class the next time, they had to write a question about music. Any question about music. And some of them were not particularly profound, but there was one about the fourth week that was incredible. Somebody wrote, why is there music? And I almost had a PhD from Northwestern in music, and I did not have an answer to that. Well, luckily, Time magazine, about that same time, came out with a huge essay about why there is music, and they went into this in great detail. And when I got to that question, of course, I answered it by saying, well, Time magazine had just come out with talk about being lucky. And we passed out, of course, that article, and I had them read it, and we did a little discussion about why there is music, which I was very excited about because I was too busy doing it rather than even thinking about why we even have music. And that's what's exciting about doing something innovative. It gets the professor thinking and doing things differently than they're used to doing. It was easy for me to lecture. It was easy for me to write lectures. That's not the point. The point was, were they learning? And then, of course, I changed the way we graded students, which I don't have time probably to tell you in much detail. But we had a music log that they did, and they listened to different musics and wrote answers to some of the questions that I was asking them. And then from there, we went to actually giving them programs of the next classical concert that the orchestra was doing. And then I would have them answer some questions about what they saw in the program based on what we were learning in our course. Like if they were learning about opus numbers, they would see that it was an early opus number that the orchestra was going to play. And how many people might be on the stage for this piece, which was a Baroque piece, and so on and so forth. And so they found out by going to the concerts, which was part of the course also, they had requirements to do that. They really actually enjoyed going to the concerts. They saw some of their friends, and they realized that the music level performance was way higher than at their high school here at the university. It was just win, 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 win. I mean, all the way down. And at some point, I took off my suit to bring the class, which I was always dressed up. And I started wearing T-shirts and things, trying to look a little different. And one day I was walking across campus with my tuxedo on to perform with the concert wind ensemble. And a student saw me and he started screaming. He said, Dr. Ross, you look incredible. You should wear that to class. You should wear it. So that week I wore a tuxedo and everybody thought that was very cool. And we talked about why we wear outfits like that for classical concerts necessarily. So you can see it just went from one thing to another to another. And ultimately, as I started to get more into teaching and learning and became a 10-year director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at the end of my career, and then started doing workshops around the world on how to design courses better, I realized that what we were really doing there, what I did by chance really, was getting at my special pedagogical challenge, which in my case was that students were saying they hated what it is that I was supposed to be teaching. And subsequently, I've heard this from many faculty as I've done workshops in different countries, different universities, doesn't matter. They often say, well, the students don't really care about what I'm teaching. And I say, well, what are you doing to get them excited? Hadn't thought about that, most of them say. Now, it's true that I was lucky that Star Wars came out and all that happened to come together, but I don't know a lot of other people that put that all together. And by the way, after a couple of years, I wrote my own textbook for the class, which was quite different than most textbooks. And It turned out to be a wonderful textbook that the students enjoyed. It was much less expensive, of course. And we actually took the money that we made from that and gave it to scholarships for music students. So another win-win that happened throughout this. And maybe the saddest part of this whole story, when you look at universities, the way they're structured. So here I had figured this all out. We had huge crowds. We had to add another section. We had 200 people showing up for a course. I had to find another room because that room was so bad. But ultimately, they decided that I was a very good teacher and on. And they decided that I needed to do other things. So they put me in charge of the master's program. And I no longer taught intro to music. And they started putting people in that were being hired that didn't know what they're doing, that didn't really care, that started lecturing again. And they went back to the old way. And that sadly is maybe not that unusual when you look at higher education and the way that we do our work. Innovation is great, but it doesn't mean that other people are going to find that innovation for themselves necessarily. And I tried to share some of these ideas with others, but was not very successful in doing that because they didn't have the background or the interest to teach the course. The only thing that was left probably of my legacy of 4 or 5 years of that course was that the title was changed from Music Appreciation to Intro to Music, which was not a small thing actually, but at least it was something that I left the university. So that's a story that I tell often because it gets at the special pedagogical challenge. In all of us teaching any college course have a special pedagogical challenge. We just need to figure out what that is. In my case, it was that students were not, they thought they didn't like what it was that I was teaching. Many people have a problem where students don't prepare for the class. They just come expecting the teacher to lecture. And then they force the teacher to do that because they weren't prepared when they come to the class. I've heard hundreds of problems that they said were, that faculty said were pedagogical challenges. And those that deal with pedagogical challenges at least have a chance to win the students over. I like to think, well, I don't like to, but I do think of this as a cancer. If you don't deal with a special pedagogical challenge in your first week or two of teaching a course with students you don't know, it's a cancer. It starts eating away first at the corners and maybe sometime right at the middle of what that core is all about. If students continue to have this incredible pedagogical challenge in your course, you are going to not be successful, which means your students are not going to be successful. So it was always fun to share this wonderful story of Star Wars and how this all turned out for me teaching this intro to music course. And I have many, many other stories of other people in different disciplines that have told me how they got over their special pedagogical challenge. So I hope that anybody can learn from this story and perhaps think about how this story would affect them given with their special pedagogical challenges. But the important point is to find out what students are thinking. Do that background probe, find out where they are, and don't just start based on what you think they should be doing. We need to get them involved, and they need to help us understand how we can help them. My pleasure. I hope that this is helpful to all of you. Thank you.